Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next session for CME Palooza Spring. I am Derek Warnick, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and this session will be on improving response rates on CME surveys with Boyce Byerly, who's principal of Level 6 Analytics. Before we get to Boyce's presentation, I have just a couple quick slides to run through. I have to read them off my paper because I'm getting old and I cannot read them off of the screen anymore. So anyway, a big thank you to our gold sponsor, Genentech, our silver sponsors, Practicing Clinicians Exchange, Platform Q Health, Helio Education Lab, Global Academy for Medical Education, ASIM, and Forefront Collaborative, and our bronze sponsors, Vivacity Consulting, Vindico, RMEI, PVI, Primary Care Network, Paradigm, InfoGraphEd, Impact Education, Highmark CE, Educational Measures, Semiology, excuse me, and Clinical Care Options, and Academy for Continued Healthcare Learning. There are 3 ways to ask questions, as always. You can use the Practicing Clinicians Exchange text line to send in a question, 267-6660-CME. You can also click on the little Google Q&A link that's located at the bottom of your of the video. You need to have a Google account to be able to ask a question, but that's also an easy way to do it. And then lastly, you can tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. Last session, I noticed a couple people asked the question through the comments on the blog. You can do that. It's not the easiest way, but we'll figure it out. I would recommend one of these 3 ways. And I'll be monitoring them at all times, and I'll give your question on to Boyce. Speaker disclosure. This is just our slide to let everyone know that any opinions, discussions, conclusions are our own or Boyce's own, and they don't represent an endorsement or position by the employer, parent company, etc. Okay, and with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Boyce, improving your survey techniques to get more data. Take it away.
Okay, thanks. I'm Boyce Byerly. I'm basically an outcomes guy, so my whole specialty is collecting and analyzing data to show the impact of outcomes. And therefore, I spend a lot of time collecting and analyzing survey data. And I want to drill down to a topic that I know has a lot of interest out there. How do you get enough data? How do you increase your response rates and get what you need to report? Well, surveys in one form or another are a cornerstone of data collection in CME. So why is it that with this new focus on collecting hard data, such as patient chart data, does this remain the case? Well, asking the person involved is the only way to gather information on a variety of levels in such a straightforward way. Data can be obtained on what participants thought of the teaching method, the faculty, whether they intend to apply the information on return to practice, real and perceived changes in knowledge level and competence, as well as information about the environment in which care occurs, barriers and enablers to transferring that knowledge into practice. And when I'm talking about levels, of course, I was applying Moore's levels, which is a pretty standard reference. But some of the new frameworks, like TIMSS, are asking about the social and psychological settings in which learning occurs. I'll talk about issues like motivation, broad-based support, community issues. And those more abstract levels point out the need for diverse soft data, whose most obvious source is surveys as well. So operational data from original sources, such as chart data, are often infeasible in practical terms for a lot of types of events. For example, when you have participants coming from numerous health systems, each with their own data collection standards and privacy rules. Asking somebody that attended a 3-day conference to help work through the challenges inherent in collecting patient data from their site is just not a realistic request. A standard, though experimentally unverified, rule of thumb that's bandied around in corporate L&D is that measurement and evaluation shouldn't exceed 5% of the time required for the entire educational effort. And it's pretty easy to imagine, from the participant side especially, that such a limit would be exceeded. So surveys remain inexpensive, well understood, well accepted. The most recent JSEP issue, all 10 original research articles use data collected in surveys, so they're not going away. But one thing that is changing is, unfortunately, the ease of sending multiple surveys via email means that there are many others who are competing for the time and attention of your participants to get data. Olson used the metaphor of tragedy of the commons to refer to how the depletion of shared resources is happening as applied to individuals being surveys. That's one of the reasons it's harder. On the other side, more sophisticated analysis, the ability to merge multiple sets of data, can extract more out of the data. For example, pinpointing what professions get the most out of training. So the stakes are increasingly getting higher, that there's more that you can do, but the competition for that resource is getting tighter. So what we're going to talk about today is several things. We're going to ask, how much data do you really need? What sort of response rates can you expect to get? And how can you improve those rates and overall get the most usable, correct data out of an interaction with an end user? So the first two of these questions, it turns out, are going to be awful questions to even think about asking, like, does this dress make me look fat? So we're going to kind of buzz through those and get to the Ann Lander style advice column bits on the last one. I'm trying to base this talk as much as I can on research verified material, and I'm primarily trying to stick to CME or at least healthcare research where I can. I'm not going to mention explicitly where I'm getting the data, but if you download the slides and read the notes, there are specific citations of the material that give you exactly where this data and research comes from. So, textbook examples use political race outcomes and soda preferences, but there's seldom one single question that determines the usefulness of a CME project. So there are closed-formed answers for providing information about how much a single question data is required, but I'm going to avoid presenting one or even several equations to produce a single answer. Those are best left to a more intense statistics-oriented presentation. Instead, I'm going to suffice with presenting the major factors to help gather the facts you need before dusting off your stats text or speaking to a professional. Most importantly, I'm going to try to keep things in the context of what people actually do in CME activity. It's probably noteworthy to say that many questions don't lend themselves to statistical analysis. For example, if I'm noting that 64% of participants check yes as to whether they gain knowledge, what's the test there? I could test to see whether 64% is different from 0%, but realistically, nobody is going to do a t-test against the zero mean there. When you get more data, for example, profession, you can ask whether doctors differ from pharmacists and so on. So there are plausible questions. The correct answer requires some math, some estimation, and guesswork, and you can work with that. With that, what do you really need to know? You'll probably need to think about the estimated means for the most important questions and the estimated difference. In other words, what do you think the difference will be between trained and untrained, or before and after condition? And are you content to show that the impact differs significantly from zero, or do you have some more ambitious goal in mind? Jason Oliveri, who's presenting here today, has written some really good blogs on this topic, and he flippantly answered the question of how much data you need with 10. Well, 10 is, of course, a rule of thumb, and it isn't theoretically pleasing, but I think everybody that wrangles numbers has dealt with some puffed up MBA who just read The Art of War demanding to know the single answer at a kind of simplicity level, somebody that's used to beating up people for their math homework. But there is some truth to 10. After years of doing this, I don't bother to analyze anything with less than 10 data points or report on a group that has less than 10 subjects. If the effect is anything to write home about, it ought to at least start to be evident if you have at least 10 people. For example, would you eat at a restaurant if you read 10 reviews and they were all noticeably positive? I would, yeah. It also has some wiggle room in it. You want to know if physicians and nurses were different? Well, get 10 of each. How about if you wanted to factor in specialty? You better make sure there are at least 10 physicians in oncology, and so on. Figuring out how many people you need to poll might not be the correct question. It's possible you don't ask that question at all in the real world. Remember I told you the first two questions are awkward and people didn't want to answer them? Well, here's why. It's because there's typically two answers in CME activities. If you're doing an activity like a conference or a symposium, it's standard to include a survey, and the answer is, I want everybody to fill it out. I want that response rate to be as high as possible for the 120 attendees or whatever. And if you're doing something more exotic, like working with chart data, the answer is, I'm going to analyze as many charts as I have funding for. So I will say that given what you can do with segmentation and demographics, more is always better, with a caveat that the smallest group is always a limiting factor. So there's no need to go out and find a 200-person control group if you've only got 100 people in your test group. So why is more the preferred answer? Well, what have we learned so far? It's hard to say how many responses you need, although there's some statistical methods you can use, starting with your assumptions about the mean responses and the standard deviations from similar work. That's not a technique CME people do much with. Again, the answer is either survey your entire audience or look at chart data until the budget runs out. So we didn't learn a whole lot. But there are several good reasons to always improve your response rates. High response rates improve the certainty of conclusions reached, particularly when you're drilling down into segments of the population, like if you're looking for the distinguishing impact based on the number of patients people have. The higher the proportion of the population that respond, the less likelihood of a selection bias that might skew the results. There are reported modest differences between responders and non-responders, and between early and late responders on demographic and practice-related characteristics. That's been multiply verified by different research. The more and the better the textual responses you get, the richer and more nuanced the text used in the write-up can be. Even if your outcomes reporting is not improved by increased response rates, the data collected and analyzed can be smaller, and that's going to save time and money. I would also argue that achieving higher response rates suggests you're treating your sample populations better. The survey pool has been identified as a community resource, which we need to protect. So, a better question than how much data do you need might be, how much data can you expect, given the circumstances you can't do anything about? Well, you can estimate using similar projects. We read a lot on this research, we've done a lot of our own work, and we felt there were three broad categories of survey that we wanted to talk about. Informational surveys are defined as those that were sent out to a broad population that have not had prior contact with the writers, such as participating in a CME event. Surveying a broad population to ascertain skill gaps during the instructional design phase is a good example of that. Second is event questionnaires, which are defined as surveys given immediately upon completion of an educational event. Mostly those are post-event studies, but sometimes there are pre- and post-event versions that are given to measure learning during the event. The third type is follow-ups, which are defined as surveys sent after an event within a 30 to 90-day window. So what did the research tell us? With technology changes in privacy laws, and an increasingly saturated audience population, it seemed prudent to only review the most recent literature. So I went through relevant journals for the last couple of years and located several dozen that were used as surveys as a major data collection tool and categorized them as event, follow-ups, and informational studies. I added those to client data, producing a data set of over 50 studies. So response rates ranged from less than 1% up to 100%. Size ranged from 25 up to over 30,000. So not including client data as disaggregated points on this graph, but the published material is summarized in a table at the end of the slide deck, so you can see what I've pulled from there if you'd like. The graph shows the response rates on the y-axis and the subject pool size on the x-axis, and the colors indicate the type of survey. The shape of the data point indicate whether it's from a level 6 client database or the published literature. So what did I learn? The most notable thing, as you can see on the x-axis, is that the response rates are just all over the place, which is kind of what I expected. There wasn't a significant difference between response rate and the size of the pool, which surprised me. So let's dig into the things that did turn out to be statistically significant. The medium mattered. I learned that the medium by which the material was presented is an important thing. More specifically, I think it's the level of engagement and interaction with the learner that matters. So I categorized the learning method as a monograph where people were just sent something via email or via the post, conference data, a symposium, which is an hour or two thing like a Grand Rounds that they were doing, or a web-based event. Monographs, which kind of a scattershot approach, not very personal, got only about an 8% response rate. Conferences where people travel, they network, they socialize, they chat face-to-face, had the highest response rates, and symposiums and web-based activities are somewhat in the middle, as you would expect.
Hey, boys, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
Did any of these surprise you?
No, this was about what I was expecting. Conferences are usually better. They rely somewhat on the abstract effect. Monographs, I was actually surprised was as high as 8%.
Interesting. Okay.
Okay. Another obvious problem is the selection bias inherent in the studies themselves. Published studies tend to be the best work. If it's not, it doesn't make it into the journals. So we can see 72% reported in journals versus 27% with what I've seen in the real world of things that I'm working with. Out of that client study, there is one study that was published, and the response rate was over 50%. So maybe the selection bias thing has some water there based on that one data point. Many of the journal articles did some very specific and intense education methods for small sets of HCPs. So if your sample size is 27 and you have a lot invested in the measurement and reporting, you're going to be spending a lot more time twisting arms, breathing down necks, looking over shoulders to make sure everything goes right and people hand their stuff in. And I also thought that some of the journal articles showed attempts to inflate the response rates with various sorts of filtering and explanation. For example, in one study where email surveys were sent out, the response rate was not calculated on the number of emails sent, but upon the number of emails opened, which is a very different number. So the moral is, assume that the journal articles are going to have double or triple your response rates, although they're probably going to be somewhat related. Don't feel too bad about this. Okay. I was surprised that I didn't get a statistically significant relationship with type because the number of informational surveys was small, there was a lot of variability, but I'll blow off what p-values were here, and I'll say that in my experience, follow-up surveys always have lower response rates than event surveys, and event surveys always have higher ones than informational ones. I don't know why the informational ones ended up with 53%. But there's more follow-up surveys in the published literature, so that might account for relatively high performance of follow-ups. Within client studies, I had access to the raw data, so I did some analytics to look at whether demographic characteristics of the subjects predicted a response rate. Most of the variables didn't. The only one I saw that showed a significant relationship were practice settings. There I saw that community hospitals were the best and teaching hospitals were the worst. So why don't people return surveys? People did some research. Baruch et al. Did one in 2008 to ask why people didn't return surveys. How we got these people to return surveys about why they didn't return surveys, I don't know. That's suspicious to me. Here were his answers. 28% said they were too busy. 14% didn't feel it was relevant. 12% reported technical issues of getting it back or things not working right. 22% said it was the company policy to not return surveys. I've never heard that. I don't know if that really applies to the medical profession or not. 24% gave no reason at all as to why they didn't return surveys.
Did they say why? Why would a company have a policy not to return surveys? I'm just curious.
I'm wondering if that's just an excuse. You know, I'm washing my hair. My wife won't let me. Whatever,
Yeah, exactly.
whatever it is.
It's one that I'll put in my list to keep for next time I get a survey.
Okay, so onto the Dear Abby section of it, where I'm providing advice for how to improve your survey rates. Some of it experimentally verified. Look through my notes if you want to find out why or which. Number one, provide advanced communication about the questionnaire. That seems intuitively important. Research on the U.S. Census, which, by the way, is one of the best researched areas for survey response rates, indicated that notifying people that the survey was going to arrive improved response rates by 6 percentage points. The research is a little muddy on this. Some medical care areas, like a study of physicians, showed no difference at all between the groups of the control group. Lockyer did promotions on these, one of the ones cited in Table 1 at the end of this. Their response rates were lower than any of the informational surveys. So, I don't know. Okay, number two, use 1 or 2 follow-up reminders. Written and telephone reminders were each associated with about a 13 percentage point improvement. So, nagging helps. 3, review the questionnaire at the end of the educational session. That helps explain the survey and gives you a chance to motivate the respondents better. 4, communicate a time limit for submitting responses. People can put a specific time on the calendar, it's more likely to get done. Okay, let me talk about motivation-specific things. Giving something away with a questionnaire seems to be one of the best things to do. Incentives use social exchange theory by causing participants to feel obligated to respond. However, some researchers suggest that providing large incentives is a model of diminishing returns. Small token, in other words, makes potential respondents feel obligated to respond, but the incentive shouldn't be so large as to suggest payment for services rendered, because then people start thinking about whether it's a good idea or not, and you don't want to be in an area of giving a doctor enough money to be worth their time, because that really doesn't work out very well for you. Payment has been shown to be a good way to improve response rates with some reservations. So what does help? Cash has been shown to help when given without delay and in a form that can be used. One study with physicians showed that while both were effective, checks were more effective than gift cards for a $25 amount. One meta-study established that even $1 provided adequate incentive to improve response rates, and effects leveled off after that, even when going up to $20. Token items such as pencils or candy don't seem to help response rates with physicians, nor do lottery chances to win some item in the future. I've had good luck with giving away movie tickets in return for survey participation. Comparative studies indicate that cash payments are more effective compared with charity inducements, monetary donations to the alma mater, non-monetary incentives, or opportunities to win a cash prize through a lottery. There's an area with commercially supported CME activities that's worth talking about. I've gotten a lot of questions with my clients on that, and that's namely the Sunshine Act and its relationship with us. So the Sunshine Act, required reporting of payments or any other transfers of value from August 2013 forward, and the reservation was that a doctor wouldn't take time out of their busy schedule to earn a $25 gift card if they knew that it put them in an open payments database and they'd have to report it later. It didn't seem like it would be worth it. But I read a lot, and some of my clients who read a lot, about the American Medical Association CME credit system and the Code of Ethics. And basically the consensus seems to be that educational grants that are given to certified and accredited programs which comply with standards don't meet the definition of indirect payment, and as such are exempt from reporting commercial supports under the Sunshine Payments Act. So in other words, if the activity, the CME activity that you're doing work on is exempt and okay, then payments made for surveys are also exempt and okay. I'm not a lawyer, but I've read a lot on this. If anybody knows more about this than I do, I would love to hear from you.
Hey, boys, just want to give you an update. We've got about 3 minutes.
Okay. Okay, a couple things. Have an introductory message signed by a executive or some other person. In the design and execution, you distribute the questionnaire to a captive audience. In other words, our best rates have been when people were filling out a survey to get credit, and the survey data is on the same thing. Second, keep the question as simple and brief as possible. There's a lot of research that says the longer the survey, the lower your response rate goes. Every minute counts. It's not known what the response curve looks like, but every minute counts. Keep responses anonymous and confidential where applicable. Make it easy to respond if you're going to use mail, the self-addressed stamped envelope. If you're using the internet, test it with a couple different browsers and computers to make sure there's no glitches. Allow completion of the survey during work or course hours instead of requiring the participant to use private time. Give a nice user-friendly design. Make it well categorized. Make it bright. Be mindful of the time it takes with physicians or other HCPs to do this. So, how do you make the survey count? Let's talk about, if you got the person predisposed, you've got them there, you want to finish and get good data. So if the data's bad or they quit midway through, you can't use their data. So let's talk about some of the tips for making good surveys and getting the most out of our data collection.
Okay, and we got to wrap this up soon or Scott's going to cut us off, so just let me know.
Okay, one piece of advice. Take some of your own surveys. I did a challenge for a month to take every survey I was handed, even like cashier satisfaction things. Nothing will teach you more about how to write a good survey than suffering through other people's that have not done well, and makes you think about what the good points are. Don't waste anyone's time on the survey. Make it short as possible. Use piping logic, as SurveyMonkey says, to make sure that irrelevant questions are not presented. So if a question is specific to a nurse, don't show it to a pharmacist. Don't ask questions you already have an answer to. Would have talked a lot more about this. In other words, if you've got data, for example, from registration, where you already know the person's profession or how many patients they serve, don't ask it again. Provide some open-ended questions, not too many because that takes a long time, but people feel like they're not really getting their money's worth in some surveys if they don't have open-ended questions. Pilot your survey, test it with other people, show a progress bar. It indicates progress through it. So, review your basics. Let's skip this slide, actually. This is...
Do that.
So don't increase numbers if it's not the right population. If you have people that you're working too hard to get, they may be straight liners that answer the same question all the way through. They may be people who are not really relevant to the population you're looking at. Tie your data sets together. The synergy of combining multiple data sets I find is really important. Putting your operations, learning, and HR data if possible is great. How do you do that? You do that by looking at common identifiers available within the studies. So if email address is the common address, you may need to go through several levels to get this, but this is very worth doing. And why tie your data together? There's an interesting reason why I have a map of Czechoslovakia up here, but it's a long story, so I won't present it today. Ask me later. Trust me, it's fascinating.
I believe it.
Look at collecting data in different ways. The reason this slide was is you might well imagine someone was collecting data and people coming in and out of a parking lot, but clearly the tracks in the snow indicate there's other sources of data there that we're ignoring. I'll just give you one example that I found wonderful. There was an intervention to increase hand washing behavior in hospitals. It's well known that people lie on surveys about whether they wash their hands or not. It was considered rude and expensive and intrusive to surveil areas where hand washing occurs. So somebody just measured the amount of sanitizing fluid used on the hospitals before and after the intervention and used that as a marker. It's simple, it's elegant, it's more accurate than the other solutions.
Hey, Boyce, I'm going to do one thing real quick. I'm going to let you finish, but I'm going to give our audience real quick. I just want to make sure they know. Scott may cut us off, but you can keep going, and this will be for the enduring part. So I just want to remind everyone, speaking of surveys, take our survey. We have a financial incentive this time. You can maybe win a gift card if you give us your email.
That's not as effective if you pay them directly, by the way.
Well, I should have talked to you before we did this. And to view the next session, you'll just need to refresh your screen. Scott will replace the video, and Boyce, you can finish off.
Okay. Great. I just wanted to summarize things here.
Okay.
Figure out how much data you need, if it's relevant. Estimate your response rates that you can expect. Always assume more is better. Always try to increase your response rates. Good things happen if you do. Communicate about surveys before and after. Give something away if possible. Use a captive audience. Keep it short and simple. And I do have to say, although there's a general one, I haven't prepared a survey to follow this event. So I think we may have a few seconds for questions, if possible.
We're actually, if we're done, we're going to finish it off then. So, Boyce, thank you very much. That was excellent. Again, for the next session, Scott will have the link up in about a minute. Just refresh your screen, and I think that's it. Thanks so much, Boyce. Really appreciate it. And I will talk with you later on.
My pleasure. Stay tuned. There's some great speakers today, folks.
Absolutely.